Hi, I'm Les Moreland. I'm the current commander, AMVETS Post 2006 here in Leesburg, Florida. And we're a proud sponsor of Central Florida Salute on the YouTube channel. I'd like to have you check us out on our Facebook page or whatever. Our address is 500 North Canal Street in Leesburg, Florida. To all you veterans out there, come by and see us. We salute you for your service and thank you very much.
Hello, welcome to Central Florida Salute YouTube. I'm your host, Bob Peters, and I have Colonel Fred Geier.
That's correct.
That's right. Geier the Flyer, your nickname.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you, Colonel, for coming. I've got your resume here. You have a distinguished career, and you were the guy who flew the presidents around. And what did they call that, Marine One?
Correct. Marine One is the aircraft that
Yeah.
the president flies in, the helicopter that he flies in.
Yeah, the helicopter, yeah. So tell me, where are you from originally?
I'm from a small town just outside of Chicago, Willow Springs, Illinois.
Okay. And what got you into the Marine Corps?
Well, my brother-in-law was a Marine, and he was injured in Vietnam and came back, and he really had no family members in the military at all. But for some reason, him and his friend motivated me to join the Marine Corps. I had a low draft number in the Chicago area during the lottery time, and I went to the recruiter and I said, I want to fly airplanes. And they said, well, we can't guarantee you that you'll fly airplanes. And the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force all said that. The Marines said, well, if you take the aviation exam and pass it, then you'll be guaranteed aviation. So I joined the Marine Corps at that time, and 71 was a big year for me. It was a trifecta. I graduated college, got married, joined the Marine Corps. Not necessarily in that order.
Well, that's good. Congratulations on that. So you joined the Marine Corps. You obviously had to go to basic, right?
Well, right after boot camp,
Boot camp, yeah.
I went straight to Pensacola, Florida, to flight school. And then after a year in flight school, I graduated and went to the East Coast to camp. It was it was New River Air Station next to Camp Lejeune. And yes, I drank the water.
Yeah, okay. That
But
explains.
that's where I did my first training and my final training in the CH-46 helicopter. I initially had orders. They said you're going to go to Vietnam. I was expecting to go to Vietnam. However, when I finished my 46 training and I was qualified, they said, hey, your orders have been put on hold. All the other services are now returning from Vietnam. The Marines haven't pulled anyone out, but we're going to see what's going to happen here in the next few months. So I was on hold for a couple months. Then they canceled my orders to Vietnam, and they said, you're going to stay here at New River Air Station. So I stayed there and deployed several times to the Mediterranean after 4 years, and then continued about the Marine Corps.
And somewhere along the line, you became a White House liaison officer and the pilot. Is that you call it for HMX-1? Do you want to tell the people what HMX-1 means?
HMX-1 is the Presidential Helicopter Squadron. Helicopter Marine Experimental 1 was the original designation from 1947 because they did work with the advent of the helicopters to see if the Marines could actually utilize the helicopter in some of their amphibious missions. And over several months they did a ship-to-shore movement and found out that the helicopter would be a very good asset to use, and the Marines adopted helicopter operations within the service. Now, before I got to HMX-1, I went to 162 in New River. Then I was stationed out in Hawaii with 265, and we deployed to the Pacific several times. And it was after that tour when I'd heard about HMX-1, which is a voluntary command, and I asked for an application. They screen all the pilots before they come there to look at their safety record, their flight hours, and where they've been stationed in the Marine Corps. Long story short, I was selected as one of the pilots coming in after I'd complete amphibious warfare school in Quantico. So I went to HMX-1 for the first time. I was happy to be there because I'd have the opportunity to fly not only the president, but the vice president and visiting heads of state. So my first assignment at HMX-1 was on the flight line as the flight line officer, and then after a few months, I became a White House liaison officer. I was one of the officers that would travel prior to trips with the White House staff, the Secret Service, and White House communications, and evaluate all of the president's stops along the way. It was during this time when not only I worked with several of the White House staff, but I got to see quite a bit on how the operations went planning a presidential trip from the White House perspective.
You know, I got to ask you a question. You and I chatted quite a bit over there, and I really enjoyed it. But I just started thinking, the helicopter was first used, was it not by Eisenhower? Because he had to get to a meeting, and they said they couldn't get him there in time.
Yes, in fact,
a true story?
It's a true story. In 1957, while President Eisenhower was at his summer home up in Rhode Island, he told his aide, he said, I got to get back to the White House on short notice. So the aide said, well, if we take the limo, it's going to take about 4 hours, just under 4 hours. If we catch the ferry going across Narragansett Bay, it's going to take us about just under 3 hours. Why don't we use the helicopter? And he says, well, it's not an emergency. And in fact, the naval aide, as everything would have it, he was familiar with helicopter operations, and he said, the Marines have their helicopter here for emergency operations, but if you ask the Marines to fly you across Narragansett Bay to Air Force One, I'm sure they would do it. So he hesitated because it wasn't an emergency, and he says, okay, let's use the Marines. So the Marines landed the helicopter, and in fact, Eisenhower got on it with the aide. They flew across Narragansett Bay. As they were exiting the helicopter at Quonset Point, Eisenhower turned to his aide and he says, why don't we do this all the time? This took us 9 minutes to get here. And that was really the first thing to start the mission of that.
The presidential helicopter.
So in fact...
And you didn't know I knew that, did you?
Well, what you didn't know,
okay,
and I didn't know it for a while, was the Air Force said, we fly helicopters and we always fly the president in Air Force One, so we can fly him in our helicopter. And the Marines said, okay, fine. So they used the old Bubble Bell, and they flew Eisenhower on a few, I don't know exactly how many missions, but they flew him out to his farm out in Pennsylvania, and they flew him a couple times to Andrews. The problem was the Bubble Bell would take the pilot, the president, and there was one more seat, and they always had an arm wrestle. Was it going to be the aide to the president or a Secret Service agent? Because everybody else had to go by van. So then, on a hot August day in Washington, D.C., they were doing a drill, an emergency drill to evacuate the White House. And Camp David was their secure location where they were going to fly to. So everybody came out and all his staff was lined up and the helicopter was there. And he was wearing his nice khaki suit. And the president gets on board the helicopter and they turn it up and they take off. Well, a hot August day in Washington, D.C. is worse than a hot day in Florida.
And he's in a suit.
And he's in a suit. And that bubble bell is like a greenhouse effect, so it must have been about 120 degrees in the cockpit. Well, they land up at Camp David. His suit is all pitted out. He gets out of the helicopter and he looks up, and here's all his staff standing there saluting him, saying, "Mr. President, how was your helicopter ride?" Because it took him about an hour to get there. And they all looked, and he said, "How the heck did you get up here?" And they said, "Oh, we came up here on this big Marine helicopter." And that ended the Air Force's involvement in Air Force and Marine One.
That's good. That's good to know. You know, that's what this show is all about, educating. So anyway, you became, and you, I've got your list here of all awards. I mean, it's numerous, quite numerous. But how many years? You did 27 years. Is that what I read?
27 years. That's correct.
Now, you must have some stories about some of your missions that you did. I guess one of them I saw on your awards and decorations was the Order of the Orange Nassau, Netherlands. What is that about?
Well, that's a unique award because it's a foreign award, and normally you don't wear a foreign award on your uniform. This award came through from Queen Beatrix to Headquarters Marine Corps, through the White House, and it was awarded, and they said, it's in your record, this will be worn on all uniforms. Now, the reason I was one of the 4 pilots selected to fly Queen Beatrix when she came to visit the U.S., and it was during that flight I flew her to the White House and then back out to Andrews, and it was during that visit when she went back to the Netherlands, she says, "I want to award those pilots an award." So they said, "Whatever you'd like, ma'am." And she said, "This is what I want to award them, the Order of the Orange Nassau." And in fact, we were awarded that thing. The bad part about that award is if it ever gets dirty or damaged, it's near impossible to get replaced. But it can be done, but you have to go through the embassy and everything else. And the second thing is, since it's unique, I became the automatic selection whenever we had an IG inspection, because the IG inspector only has a certain amount of time in front of each individual that he inspects. And they would always do the inspection and look, and as soon as he'd see my medals, he would look and he'd ask, "What's that medal and where did you get it?" So by the time I told the story, he had to go on to the next person. So they always said, "Fred, you're going to be the IG uniform person." I said, "Oh, I didn't like that." But it was very interesting flying the Queen Beatrix. The other thing is, during that first tour, I had the opportunity to fly a visiting head of state, and it was Prince Charles and Lady Di. And over all the years, I started thinking as I would talk about the presentation of what I'd done in the presidential mission, and I thought, here I flew the Prince and Lady Di, and now she's no longer with us, and Prince Charles is now the King of England. It's amazing how you don't realize these things because they just happen in normal duty, and then as time goes on, I had the honor to fly the King.
Wow. It's an amazing life you had, my friend.
But you asked about a story, and I have to admit, one of the funniest stories I had.
And we're going to get to it right now.
Was when President Reagan was he was visiting England, and he was going to do the 40th anniversary of D-Day. And he had to fly from England going across the Channel. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of my jobs was the White House liaison office, so I was there preparing for the trip. I'm in a big office, or in a big conference room, and there were about 2 or 3 admirals in the room, more Navy captains than I could remember, and a plethora of other people in the room. And I was telling them that I'd like the USS Eisenhower to be in the channel along our course of flight so the president could fly by and see the Eisenhower. Now, it was also a good emergency platform for us to use if anything happened. Well, as I was saying this Navy admiral gave me a long dissertation about the English Channel is so busy, you can't turn a carrier on the spot, and they're so busy we can't do a 180-degree turn with the carrier, and it can't be done. So I very calmly says, okay, and he says, so what now? I said, I'll call back to the White House and tell them that the Eisenhower can't do it. Well, you could hear a pin drop in the room. Now, in all honesty, I would have called back to the White House and I would have said the Eisenhower can't do it, and I would have told the same story that the Admiral just told me. It's too busy, a carrier can't turn in the middle of the channel. And the aide would have said, okay, well, just find out what the location of the Eisenhower is and we'll make something else work out. Now, getting back to that pin drop and total silence in the room, the Admiral says, Major, I was a major at the time, he says, put your finger on the map. I said, sir? He says, put your finger on the map. So I put my finger on the map, and he says, gentlemen, get this coordinate down. He starts yelling out coordinates, and everybody's writing and everything. He says, okay, move your finger. So I moved my finger off the course of flight, the line of flight, and he says, the Eisenhower will steam down this course for 10 miles, do a 180-degree turn, come back that course through the center, 180 degrees after 10 miles, and they will do that until they're released on station. Is that acceptable, Major? And I said, yes. And I couldn't believe how powerful my finger was at that point. But I'll never forget that story as long as I live.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. Let me ask you, how many, when the helicopter, obviously you're one of the pilots, but you're the only one, or because there must be a backup, pilot that if you can't make it that day, they get this other guy, or what? No?
Well, when you're in the squadron, and I'll get to it when I talk about commanding the squadron, but usually in HMX-1, the squadron commander is the primary pilot for the president. Along with that, there's usually 5 other pilots that are designated to fly the president, depending on the situation. During the election year, and the good and the bad news is both times I was there, the first time during President Reagan's re-election campaign, and the second time when I was a commander during President Clinton's re-election campaign. Since they do so much traveling around the state, we normally go up to about 8 command pilots other than the commander. And that's only because you can't be in 2 places at one time. If we leave D.C. and I was to fly the president in Washington, D.C., he gets on Air Force One and he flies to Chicago. Well, there has to be a pilot there to fly the president in Chicago. And after an hour on the ground there, after he gives a speech, he flies out to St. Louis. And there has to be another Marine One pilot to fly the president there. And the same thing. So when you're covering 3 and 4 cities in one day, and using Marine One, there has to be a Marine One pilot in each of those locations. And then when it really gets busy, then you start hopscotching pilots around to accomplish the mission in all the states that he visits.
I know in the Air Force, Air Force One, it's only called Air Force One when the president's on board. Is that does the same thing apply? That
is the same thing that applied. Early on, I can't remember what year exactly, but FAA said it is too hard to follow the flight of Air Force One, and we need to have a different call sign, because at the time they would call it Air Force 29000, whatever the bureau number was of that aircraft. And they said we have to come up with something else so we know it's the president. Now, this was before all the intricate transponder codes and everything that we have nowadays, but they still use that. So what they came up with is the call sign of the service that is flying the president will be Air Force One. When he flies the Air Force jet, it's Air Force One. When he flies the Marine helicopter, it's Marine One. History was made when President Bush said, I was a pilot, I want to fly the aircraft going out to the carrier, because he flew out to the carrier. And everybody was nervous, saying, oh gosh, what are we going to do? So the CO of the S-3 that he flew in was the commander. The co-pilot was President Bush. The jump seat was the Air Force One pilot, because he was familiar with all the communications and everything that needed to be said and done during the operations, and they flew that mission. And history was made because it was the first and only time that Navy One flew the president. As soon as he landed on the deck, everybody let out a sigh of relief because he made a carrier landing, and that was the first and only time Navy One. He never used Coast Guard at all. Now, Army One was used because early on, why they did it, I don't know, but early on, the mission was divided. 2 weeks to 3 weeks, the Army had the mission, and then 2 to 3 weeks, the Marine Corps would have the mission. And it was a split mission. They had half of the VIP aircraft, and the Marines had the other half. So when he flew in the Army aircraft, it was Army One. When he flew in the Marines, it was Marine One. Well, they finally consolidated that, and the Marines took the entire mission. So the only two call signs now are Air Force One and Marine One.
Let me ask you, you were talking about, and I'm just thinking now that,
You're thinking?
Yeah. Hey, I was Air Force, brother. Be careful. But you fly him from the White House to Air Force One, where he has to take off and go. And then he lands in, say, England, what have you. Then he's got to go someplace else. How many helicopters do they use? I mean, obviously there must be some helicopters overseas that it takes him to his events, right?
Yeah, that is a very complex.
I'd like to ask complex questions.
And I wish I had the presentation I give, because I have these diagrams. But traditionally, for any presidential movement, you have two white tops, Marine One, and I say the backup, but that normally carries the Secret Service. And then you have one or two aircraft that we used to fly the 53 and 46 for support missions. Now they fly the Osprey, the V-22, for the support missions. But then you have roughly 4, possibly 5 aircraft that fly the president. So every package you have, say, 4 aircraft to fly a presidential mission. So now, during a campaign, you have to have a package of aircraft, 4 to 5 aircraft, in every stop that the president is going to make. Stateside, it's fairly easy because you fly the helicopters to Chicago, you fly another package to St. Louis, you fly another package to Dallas, until there's a point when you have to tell the White House, we're out of toys, we don't have any more helicopters. Now, it gets much more complex when he goes on a European or an overseas trip. It gets more complex because when I was in the squadron, it was limited, and I'll talk about what they do nowadays, but we would sit there. The president would think, I'm going to England. Well, we'd think, going to England, no problem, we can support that. But then the president thinks just like he's back in the States, and he goes, as long as I'm in England, I might as well go over to France and see, at the time it was Mitterrand, and then from there, I think I'll go over to Ireland and visit somebody and go to Germany and then return home. So now we had to have helicopters in all these places. We would fly the white tops over by C-5s, and we would disassemble them. We'd have to remove the rotor blades, transmission, engines, and everything. It would take roughly 15 hours to disassemble and 18 hours to reassemble. So it became a very involved trip because you'd have to allow time to break down and to build up the helicopters, to fly what we used to call penalty time, to fly 5 hours just to make sure all the components were still working and there weren't a lot of leaks or any leaks at all, and then we could fly the mission. So it was much more involved. Nowadays, and we would use local assets. We'd use sometimes Air Force assets, especially in England, and Army assets when we were over in Germany and other locations from in-country. They would be detached to the squadron detachment, and then they would fly our support missions. Nowadays, since the V-22 Osprey is the support aircraft, they can fly the V-22 from Quantico, Virginia, overseas to England, and it takes roughly, I think it was 13 hours, and they would refuel, I think, 2 or 3 times, aerial refuel, but they could fly over there and get the assets there. I just can't fathom that idea because that's quite an extensive trip for those crews and for the aircraft. But yet, talking to the CO that's there now, he says, we've done it several times. He says, and it's great because we have our own assets overseas all the time.
It's amazing if you do military history, how things have changed, like World War II, World War I, it ain't over till it's over there. These men and women, they would go overseas to fight in a war. You never heard anything about them. You never knew if they were coming back. Some of them never came back. That's one of the things I learned over there when I did my recent trip to Normandy. And nowadays, I talk to the younger soldiers, Afghanistan, Iraq, they have their cell phones and they can communicate. You get an hour or whatever it is to talk to your family, which is fantastic. When I was overseas, you waited for what they called Maggie's drawers. that was a pair of red underwear, long johns. They put it up on a flagpole, and you knew the mail was in. And if you got a box of cookies, you were a hero.
And it lasted about 5 minutes.
Oh yeah, but it's like you say, nowadays you can't believe what they can do now. But it's.
I was just talking about a month ago about that very thing. I said, when I used to go on deployments all around different locations, Pacific, Mediterranean, whatever, I said I used to put numbers on my letters because the mail, I'd get a letter and I didn't know what my wife was talking about. And then we realized, so we started numbering the letters, and I'd get mail call, and I'd get number 1, 5, and 7.
Yeah.
So I'd go, okay, I didn't get all the mail.
Yeah.
And then, sure enough, the next mail call, I'd get 2, 3, 4, and then I'd slowly catch up. So we used to laugh about that. But you are so right. Nowadays, people have email, they have FaceTime, they have everything, SATCOM. We used to climb into 46 up to 10,000 feet, and we'd go use our high-frequency radio, and we used to call Loring, Maine, and get a phone patch. We'd call them, Loring, this is Chatterbox 432. And they'd say, oh, go ahead, can I get an Audubon phone patch? Sure, stand by. Get a phone patch and you talk to your wife, and she used to have to say over and everything, but that was the only way we could ever talk. Or, and when we got into port, wait in a queue for everybody that was waiting to make a 2-minute call that would cost about $20.
I was overseas, my grandmother passed, and they put me through to Radio Free Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And same, like you said, it took forever, but that's the only way you could do it. But it's amazing what they do nowadays. And I could imagine when you were in what you had to do to keep these, the president's schedule and all. Now they can, it's amazing.
One other funny story that I have to tell you. On the first Marine One was an H-34, a green H-34. And that was way before air conditioning and everything was in helicopters. And in the summer, it would get hot, and they'd say, we got to do something to cool off the helicopter. Mm. So one young Marine in maintenance says, why don't we paint the top of the helicopters white, and that would reflect the sunlight, and it's bound to be cooler in a helicopter. So everybody complained because they said, you know how hard it's going to be to keep that clean? We'll try it. So they painted one white, and it made a difference, but instead of 101 degrees, it was like 99 degrees. So they said, nah, this isn't going to work. Well, as luck would have it, one of the aircraft was in maintenance, so they had a presidential lift, and they had to use the one that had the white top. President Eisenhower got in it, flew it, got out of it at Andrews Air Force Base, went up to the pilots and says, what a great idea. This is a lot cooler than it was before. Got back to the squadron, and they said, paint all the tops white. The president likes it.
Yeah, the guy went from a 0 to a hero.
That's right. Well, the one thing you should let me talk about at least, because now my career is getting interesting.
Okay.
We go, I was back in Hawaii, and I was selected to command the Flying Tigers, HMM 262. One of the best squadrons I ever had, because the Fleet Squadron is just a lot of fun. You have young aviators that are just learning their career and learning their trade, and you get to go different places on deployment. And it was just a fantastic time. We went on a 6-month deployment, and we were extended because of things happening. Well, let me back up. It was during Desert Storm, and we knew we were going to deploy to the desert. We deployed to Japan, and we knew we'd redeploy to the desert. As soon as we landed in Japan, the commanding general there said, Fred, he says, you know, you've got a great squadron. It's a composite squadron. You have 46s and 53s. We're going to keep you here because you can do anything I need in the Pacific. I'll redeploy all my other squadrons before I redeploy you. So it was a pat on the back and a kick in the groin, but we did, aye, aye, sir. Well, unbeknownst to us, there were some things going on in the Philippines that 2 weeks after we landed, they immediately said, you have to redeploy 4 aircraft down to the Philippines because there's some things going on. We're going to be deploying some other Marines down there. And there was an attempted coup and some other things that really never made a lot of news. But they went, I sent my XO and a detachment of 4 aircraft down to the Philippines. And I was sitting there thinking, oh, great, I'm here in Japan, but the 4 aircraft are down in the Philippines. I know they're having a great time flying everything. Well, about 2.5 to 3 weeks later, he said, I hate to do this to you because I know you just unpacked.
I'm going to send you to
He says, but I want to redeploy your whole squadron to the Philippines. So we said, aye, aye, sir. So we redeployed the whole squadron to the Philippines. Now, what should have been a 6-month deployment, we were there for 11.5 months. And like I told the guys, I said, you know, there's worse places to be. But I said, hey, we're here. We finally left and went back to Hawaii. And 8 days later, Mount Pinatubo blew, and they had to evacuate all of QB Point and Subic Bay. So we were just ahead of that, and we were lucky to get out of there. Now, after that squadron, that's when I went to the War College, and after the War College, I was in the Pentagon, dreaded the Pentagon. I just got to the Pentagon, I got this cryptic call saying, would you be interested in being the next commander of HMX-1?
Wow.
I said, sure, because it's a voluntary position. They said, okay, well, we're going to put you on the short list. Boom, nothing. Didn't hear anything. About 3 weeks later, I got a call. Okay, just to verify, you still want to be the commander of HMX-1? I said, yes. They said, okay, we'll be in touch. Click. I said, what the heck is going on? About 2 days later, they called and they said, well, we got good news and bad news. I said, well, what's the bad news? The bad news is you're going to have to leave the Pentagon early. The good news is you're the next commander of HMX-1. So I think that phone is still swinging by the cord of my desk thinking, I'm out of here.
And you were doing your happy dance.
That's right. I went down to HMX as the commander. Now, you were asking before earlier, and I never had a chance to answer it, but you said, how big is HMX? Well, HMX, when I was in command, I had 739 people in my command.
Wow.
72 pilots and just over 100 security guards because they provide security 24/7 wherever those helicopters are around the world. So it's a huge, I say it's the size of an air group really, but it's just a tremendous organization and we do a great mission.
Oh, yeah.
And I tell people over and over again, they say, what was your best flight? I mean, I've got a lot of best flights, but you know, the one flight that you know that no one else can do is when you fly into the White House. You fly into the White House, and the first time you go into the White House, you think, wow, that's the White House. Wow, I've got the president on board. And you land there and you think, this is something other people can't do.
Oh, yeah.
And then on your last flight, you fly into the White House, you have the president on board, and it's just as exciting as the first time you flew there. So with that, I'll tell you, it's been a brilliant career. After that, I was lucky enough to really do the flip side of the mission. I retired from the Marine Corps at 27 years. Immediately, I was hired by Sikorsky Aircraft to ultimately do the flip side of the business and restore the aircraft and rework the aircraft going back to HMX-1.
Yeah, you were telling me it was Sikorsky because you said it's in Connecticut. Now, that's not far from me, and I've been there with the Corsair, I think, was out of there.
Yeah, they did that, yeah.
Yeah, they did that too, and it's just amazing that we were actually kind of close together there.
Yeah.
Once again, we didn't know each other. But I wanted to ask you one very important question. Before we leave, I know we're running out of time, unless there's something else you want to talk about, but I want to ask you this one question.
All right, go ahead.
Do you know a retired Marine named Major General David Kaufman.
That name, not only does it ring a bell, but that gentleman used to work for me when he was a first lieutenant.
Does he know how to use a phone? Does he ever call you?
I really don't think he does, because I've called him a couple times and he never answers the phone.
Dave, we're talking to you. Well, anyway, we got to go. He's another tremendous Marine and officer, and we had the honor of having him on our show. And
I'll tell you, he's a fantastic officer, a fantastic pilot. And I heard he was coming to Florida after he retired. I called him, I talked to him one time, and he goes, "Sure, let's get in contact again."
Yep.
And he never answers the phone.
that's
Dave.
we have something in common.
Stretch, yeah.
Yeah, Stretch. But we got to say goodbye. This is how we do it. To all our veterans out there, active military and their families, we salute you for all you do. Till next time. Thank you, Colonel.